All right. How do I make this full screen? Oh, I guess this is fine.
Who came up with the name? That you doing?
Yes.
Very
Thank you. Not original to me, but okay. Well, now I wish that it was really actually full screen. Okay. I don't know. Ooh. Ooh. Okay. There we go. So that y'all can see it better. I think that'll work. Okay. So this is the second Sunday. Usually, this is space that our anti-racism team takes to do education around, of course, anti-racism and faith. And we decided that for this month and next month, we would take some space for sort of our reconciling team. So Reconciling Ministries is the organization affiliated with the United Methodist Church that does work around LGBTQIA inclusion, but also intersectional justice issues. And so we have a small group here that helps kind of head up anything related to that at Green Street, particularly our presence at Pride. So we are in the process of prepping for Pride, which is June 14th. And so on Tuesday evenings at 6 o'clock, we gather lately in here, sometimes in the fellowship hall, to make things to give out at Pride, to put together bags of candy, and just to plan and dream about our presence at Pride, because that's important. We've been a visible presence there as a church for a really long time, long before I was ever here. So that's a great thing. But we wanted to just take some intentional time to have some conversation. This church has been open and affirming place for a really long time. 2009 is when we became a Reconciling Ministries congregation. But things change, language evolves, things shift, and it's always good to continue learning. And that's a lot of what we're going to be doing today. So I will note that I am not an expert on any of this. I have degrees, but not in like gender and sexuality studies. And many of you will have expertise that I do not have, whether from your personal experience in life or other thing, your work, your education, whatever it might be. So just know that as we move through this, I fully embrace and welcome interruptions, questions, additions, whatever it might be, and hope that we'll have some conversation as we go along. So we're going to start by defining some terms, and we do have a resource, a glossary from Reconciling Ministries Network. There's some printed copies of it over there, as well as a QR code if you'd rather have a digital form. There will be no quiz, but these are just some distinctions that I think are helpful. So when we use the term, and people vary of how they use these terms, right? The term sex usually refers to biology, so chromosomes, hormones, and anatomy, mostly assigned at birth. So you will sometimes hear terms like assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth. Gender is a social construct having to do with a person's self-representation regarding roles, behaviors, expression, and identity, and may or may not match one's sex assigned at birth. Any questions about that? Okay, great. Some other terms, so sexual orientation is who we are attracted to romantically, sexually, emotionally, etc. And gender identity is one's internal sense of self and their gender. When we talk about gender, usually we're talking about either your cisgender, so that's someone whose gender identity corresponds with their sex assigned at birth. So if you were assigned male at birth and identify as a man, you're cisgender. Transgender is someone whose gender identity does not correspond with their sex assigned at birth. That can look a lot of different ways. If you were assigned female at birth and identify as a man or non-binary, that you may identify as transgender. And also just a general reminder we don't necessarily label others. This is helpful for understanding kind of how sex and gender work, but we always want to follow other people's lead in identifying themselves. Gender expression is how someone presents their identity externally through clothing and mannerisms, which may or may not meet our expectations for their gender identity. So a reminder, you cannot tell someone's gender identity just from looking at them. I think this is an important thing to remember. And this is the gender unicorn. Some of you may have seen, there's the genderbread person is a commonly used diagram. I heard there was once a gender Gumby that didn't really catch on, unfortunately. But the gender unicorn, it's just a way of kind of visualizing some of these distinctions and categories. So someone's gender identity is how they identify internally. Gender expression is the external representation of that. Sex assigned at birth, again, chromosomes, hormones, anatomy. This is actually like a complex soup of things that we might talk a little bit more about. And then physical attraction and emotional attraction, which can look different ways for different people. Any questions about the gender unicorn or observations? I feel like I'm in teacher mode. Okay, and so I really think that the whole conversation around gender expression and gender identity is an interesting and an important one. And in our congregation, timely, we recently had a musical guest, Chris Matthews. If you missed her, she was amazing. And she has a great song called Suit and Tie. And she wrote this song in response to drag bans in Tennessee. And the way that law was written, it was so broad as having to do with, if anyone is wearing clothing that doesn't match their sex, then they could be arrested. And Chris is a queer cisgender woman who likes to wear a suit and tie. That's part of what the title of the song comes from. And so she realized that even she would have been targeted by these drag bans. And her song is beautiful. It tells a couple different people's stories. It talks about a young person realizing that they are trans, someone who embraces their non-binary identity, and then just her own story of being a woman who presents more masculine and sometimes gets gendered in ways that don't actually match her identity because of that. So I think this is just a helpful thing to think about, and Chris is wonderful. So if you don't know her music, check it out. Some more terms. So we'll see these acronyms sometimes: LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA+. Some of us recently learned LGBTQ as a way of saying thank you, Chris, for bringing that to our congregation. And these stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, sometimes questioning, intersex, asexual, and then the plus indicates others. And this acronym will look different depending on where you are. So for example, I recently was at a conference in Montreal, Canada, and the one in the acronym was included 2S, which means two spirit, and that's identity unique to Indigenous communities, and there were a lot of Indigenous communities present. So it was LGBTQ 2S. I can't remember the order of them, but so that's what a lot of these mean. Question, Judith?
What was intersex again?
Great question. So intersex are people who are born with ambiguous anatomy. And one thing that's interesting, so that when I said that chromosomes, anatomy, hormones can be kind of not as clear cut as we think. I think about 1% of the population is intersex, and often what happens is when children are born and you can't immediately tell, is this a boy or a girl, there will be corrective surgery done. So whenever you hear politicians talk about mutilating kids, they're never talking about that. They're talking about trans kids, but we actually probably need to be thinking a lot more seriously about intersex folks and how we force them physically into these binary boxes from infanthood. There is a great documentary called Everybody that came out a couple years ago, and it features several intersex activists who share about their own stories and talk about just the importance of being more aware that sex is not actually a binary, even in terms of science and what we call nature. It's just not actually that clear cut. And a lot of legislation really erases and harms people who are intersex. So.
Another quick question. You just mentioned two-spirited.
Yes.
And I just heard that recently, and I really like it. And I wondered, is it bad form for other people to use it?
It is generally considered bad form because it has a specific cultural meaning. So there are other identities like bigender or genderqueer that maybe non-Indigenous people might embrace that are maybe not exactly the same, but a corollary. But two-spirit does have a specific cultural meaning for Indigenous folks. So yeah.
I thought A was for allies.
Well, so sometimes it gets used that way. That's not necessarily my preference, and I'll explain why on the next slide. Buddy. A is for August. So I'll just say, because that is actually a good question. So sometimes people will ask why we put all of these letters together, because this represents like a wild diversity of experiences and not all the same. And we put LGBTQIA+ together not because they're the same, but because they are oppressed and excluded by interlocking systems of patriarchy, heteronormativity, homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and more. So a lot of times, and this is something, there could maybe be a corollary if you think about like the acronym BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It's not that those groups have the same experiences, but they are all oppressed and excluded by white supremacy, right? So we're sort of pointing to these systems of oppression when we talk about this. And hopefully there is solidarity among these groups and overlap too. You can be more than one letter in the LGBTQ. Any more questions about? Oh, wow. Go ahead, Nate.
Well, is that the previous slide there for ally versus
Sure.
asexual? Is that
That's some of it that I think, yeah.
Oppressed, I guess.
And there certainly are spaces where being an ally is risky, but there's always that privilege that's there that you just always have if you're an ally. So, depending on the context, but generally speaking, for me, yeah, I'll speak for myself. That's how. And just some things, another just example of why it actually matters to not split out those letters too much. So there are a number of changes that have happened under the current administration, one of which is that on the left is how the State Department's travel website for LGBTQI plus travelers used to look and how it looks now. Now it only says LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual. And this is one of many examples of trans folks being erased from official government websites. And this is intentional, and it's very harmful to trans people, and it does LGBT people no favors either. So this is something to pay attention to, and this is correlated with changes in how passports are issued and the way that sex and gender are indicated on official IDs. And another example is at Stonewall, transgender references were removed from the National Monuments website, which if you know anything about Stonewall is deranged because it was started by trans women of color. But so this is something that is pervasive right now. And so one thing that I think is really important for us as a church that is queer affirming is that we continue to insist on the rights and dignity of trans folks and keep those letters together and say that there's that solidarity and focus there. Yes.
What happened here?
So any reference to transgender folks has been removed from official websites. Because and Stonewall is a key piece of trans history, but if you read the website right now, you wouldn't know that. Yeah. And speaking of so Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson are two sort of luminaries of trans history. These are both trans women of color. And, Marsha, there was kind of the saying that Marsha threw the first brick at Stonewall, and she kind of said, well, maybe not the first, but the second. So these folks were really integral to the history of trans liberation, faced a lot of pushback and exclusion from the gay liberation movement as well, which is an important history to know. But there's no queer liberation without trans folks. And that's just an important thing for us to emphasize. Anything else? Okay, pronouns. Let's talk about pronouns. Here are a bunch of pronouns. She, her, he, him, they, them, zir, zim. So these are called neopronouns that folks have developed for folks who don't identify with she, her, or he, him. They're less common. Some people don't like to use any pronouns and prefer you just to always use their name when you refer to them, as I use they, them pronouns for a made-up person who doesn't use pronouns. Some people use any pronouns. They may identify as gender fluid or gender queer. Some people use more than one pronoun. So I have my pronoun pin. I use she, they pronouns. This means different things for different people. For me, it means I don't not identify as a woman, but it doesn't tell my whole story of gender. And so that's mine. And you cannot tell a person's pronouns by looking at them. So that goes back to the question of gender expression versus gender identity. Sometimes we look at somebody and we think that person's a woman who uses she, her pronouns, and that may or may not be true. And so it's always good to ask, but it's also always good to consider the context when you're asking someone to share their pronouns, because for some people, sharing pronouns is coming out, and if they're in a space that's not safe, you might be asking them to choose between either misgendering themselves or coming out in an unsafe way. And so sometimes there are church groups that I'll say, you can share, we'll do introductions, share your pronouns if you want to. And so there's an invitational thing, and especially for folks who maybe feel safer or have more privilege, sharing your pronouns can be a way to signal to other people that it's okay for them to do the same. Any questions about pronouns? Yes.
What is Z or X?
Those are the neopronouns, so those usually refer to folks who don't identify as a man or a woman, and so they're less commonly used, but there have been a lot of efforts over the years to create new pronouns that will signify something other than he or she.
Do we have them for other languages also?
There are a lot of languages that have a lot more flexibility in pronouns than English does, so yeah, our language reinforces binaries in ways that are annoying here, so yeah. Carrie.
I was just going about the Z's or
Yeah. Yeah, those are called neopronouns.
So, were you saying that, for example, if I meet someone, I mean, I would not do this, but don't ask them.
You can. It's just be aware of the context. Like if you're in a large group setting and you're asking somebody on the spot in a big group to share their pronouns, then that's just something to be thoughtful about. Yeah, you can always ask. And if you're talking to somebody one-on-one, you're not going to need to use their pronouns because it's a third person thing, but it's more about when you're referring to them, to other people.
And again, to review, because my brother's family were asking me about this, I want to get it straight. So people are they, them, for example, which is something they're not accustomed to. I need to tell them it's gender identity or expression. I'm confused about
Identity, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so pronouns have to do with someone's gender identity. And so that's...
What does they, them mean? How do they think of themselves?
So it depends on the person. A lot of people who identify as non-binary use they, them pronouns, but so that's the thing. You can't necessarily nail all of this down. A lot of it, to me, I think of it as this is like a relational thing, that if you're trying to get to know a person, you would get to know their name, where they're from, what they do. You can also get to know their gender identity and pronouns, and it may not map on, quite as neatly as we're used to in some contexts. So, yeah. Dave.
We have a little Airbnb, and somebody came in, and she said that someone else was coming in and would be with them, and kept referring to as they and them and them. And so I'm trying to decide whether or not I need to bring the cot out so that there's separate sleeping arrangements. And we wandered around with they and them, and finally she said, well, she doesn't need that.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
But it's happening in just everyday stuff.
Yep.
You need to be aware of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. People are people everywhere. Yes.
A brief word of caution about our accent also, if you're from here like I am, because sometimes my southern accent comes out a lot more. My daughter kept getting upset with me because she thought I was referring to her partner as him, but I was saying M, without the TH.
Uh-huh.
And so I kept having to say, no, I'm sorry, it's really just I'm tired. My accent's coming out, and I promise. So
Nice.
I've come across that a couple of times, actually.
Southern accents, wonderful and
We got
hazardous.
y'all,
That's what I'm saying. Southern, yeah, y'all is such a useful pronoun. There we go, pronouns.
I have no accent, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. And just a word too that one thing we talk about a lot is like if someone uses pronouns that either you're not familiar with or aren't what you expected, you're gonna mess up. And that's okay, but just try to catch it in the moment and correct yourself. Don't make a huge deal out of it, because as soon as you go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, then you put that person in the position to say, oh, it's okay, when it might not be great, and it puts the work on them to sort of take care of you in that moment. So as much as we can just sort of move along and correct and keep going, that's kind of the best approach.
I just try to use the person's name.
Sure.
So that's always safe.
Anything else on pronouns? Yeah.
That's on the last screen, but how do you define queer?
How do you define queer? All right. Wow. Okay. So queer is an umbrella term, and I'll name that queer was used as a slur for a long time. So there are older generations of gay and lesbian folks for whom that word is still not very comfortable, right? So that's just something that I always have to be aware of. Queer can refer to a lot of different things. So it can refer to gender identity, it can refer to sexual orientation, but it's often kind of a broader umbrella for folks. So it depends. It means different things for different people, which I know is not a helpful answer, but that's kind of just the true answer for a lot of this stuff.
Does that mean it's appropriate well, I guess it depends on your relationship with the person that you want to converse with about how they would define queer to themselves.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that. Other than, I guess if you're curious about someone, maybe you should try to find out about them in other ways before you get to like, how do you define yourself being queer, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Seems insensitive.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't be weird about stuff. You know, I don't know. That's like a good rule. Judith.
When you're on Zoom, like for years I didn't use she, my pronouns, but because I didn't know what it meant or what I was doing or not doing or promoting or not promoting or whatever. So could you just go over that again? You said it, but it was fast. So is it that by using the pronouns and in every situation you are aiding people and feeling more comfortable? Or am I alienating others? Like I don't know what I'm doing when I'm doing it.
Sure. And again, it depends on the context. But generally speaking, in using pronouns as a way to signal to other people that it is safe to share their pronouns, or may be safe, we'll say that. You know, right now there's a move to remove pronouns from a lot of official communications and all this kind of stuff. I'm leaning real hard into religious liberty these days and saying we're going to continue to use a lot of this language and practices that are being banned other places because we're a church and we can do that. But yeah, so the idea is that if you are, even as a cisgender person, saying your pronouns, that signals to someone else that you're not going to like jump down their throat if they decide to share theirs. So, yeah. Yes.
What about honorifics? I haven't seen any changes there. Do you just
There
not
are. Yes. Sage, do you have something to say? Sage has been giggling through this whole
I just
thing.
hate it because I can't find an honorific that I like.
Right, and that's the problem. So you will sometimes see people, so we have like Mr. and Ms., and then there's MX is I don't even actually know how you say that aloud, I will be honest. I'm just realizing this. But that's a sort of a gender neutral honorific. I mean, Reverend is gender neutral, which is great, doctor, you know. So there have been efforts, kind of like with the neo-pronouns, to develop other ones, but it's, you know, language evolves and it can take a while to settle on something and may or may not fit for a given person, but yeah.
I'll just share that, like when I was teaching people to know, they did Mrs. Saxton, which I loved, you know, Ms., which students really never used. But it's safer to say professor or teacher, like in other languages, they'll address you, they'll say teacher, and you know,
Mm-hmm.
or professor. And so I'm observing and noticing, of course, I'm more comfortable using no pronouns because it seems to be wildly unclear in terms of the context.
Mm-hmm.
So like, not that I'm against them, but I do feel like it would be more clear to honor everybody if we didn't have them, you know, which is probably terrible. What I'm saying.
No, that's not, it's
But I'm
not
just saying
terrible.
That's where I am in my head.
I get that. Yeah, I mean, and I think for some people that is actually gender affirming. For some people, using their correct pronouns is very gender affirming because it makes them feel seen and known as who they are. And so, you know, maybe not using pronouns to make sure you don't mess it up. That's one way to do it, but there's not messing up, and then there's affirming and welcoming and caring for people. And so, yeah, it's language changes and evolves, and we can too. Oh, go ahead.
So when I like to be referred to as MS, when someone says Mrs., it takes everything in me not to be trippy.
Uh-huh.
Because I'm not married,
Uh-huh.
and when I was still Ms.
Uh-huh.
So Ms. really is safe, I think.
And we can talk, there's a whole rabbit hole we could go down about how we have different honorifics for women who are married or not. Yeah, that's something we could get into for sure. Yes, Dawson.
I will just mention in linguistics, there are categories of words that are easily adaptable, like verbs and nouns. And there are categories of words that are functional and basic and just pretty much don't adapt. And pronouns are a category that pretty much don't adapt. So I don't think that people who struggle with this are necessarily trying to be offensive. Like, it's deep in our brains that this is not, you know, you can put your portmanteaus together easily with verbs and nouns and things and make new words like that, and everybody can pick it up and integrate it into that language really super easy, but it does not.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, nobody's saying this is easy, and we can practice and learn and get better at it. And so I think that's the main thing that I hear from folks is they want they want to know that folks are trying, and that there's care and intention around that.
While you were on sabbatical, one of your guest ministers came up and gave a brilliant sermon, and this person was in a relationship that I think they were introduced or identified somewhere as non-binary. Now that leaves me completely in the dark about what that meant. And I went to them after the service and said, I'm so confused. Can you tell me what that means to you? And they said, we don't actually know either. And that really made me feel a lot better. They're just as confused as I was, because they're sort of not sure exactly this fluidity thing. I don't exactly understand, and apparently they didn't either.
Well, and I think to me there's a little distinction between just being confused, because that is something that's been used to dismiss people who are exploring gender identity, and just saying we live in a culture that is binary, and so when you're trying to claim something between or beyond that, that's hard, and we don't always have the language that you can clearly claim that feels right. So yeah, that's just sort of my little caveat to that piece. But yeah, Kim. Sorry, Elizabeth.
I realize there might not be an answer to this because that's probably a weird Venn diagram of situations. But having lived in like a few different parts of the South, especially like rural North Carolina, there are settings in which, especially as a younger person and as a younger white person, it is really important that you use formal pronouns like ma'am or sir. Are there because like it was a thing living in Atlanta.
Sure.
Because like sometimes there would definitely be situations where like it would be disrespectful to not use ma'am or sir. But also, like, when I was in grad school, like, there were, like, non-binary people in Atlanta, and you'd be like, I don't want to misgender people, but also I don't want to be disrespectful by, like, not using this. Like,
Yeah. I giggled because I've seen some, like, jokey tweets about, like, captain or some other gender-neutral things. But, yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think the best thing is just to ask someone what title they prefer. Does anybody know of a good... besides captain, gender neutral?
We made a whole name out of this in my department at work.
Oh, yeah.
I got real tired of people calling me ma'am, and I was like, okay, anytime someone comes up with a gender neutral replacement for that, just shout it out, and we're gonna, brainstorm it together.
Amazing. You land on anything interesting
yet?
yet?
Because we already have someone in my department who goes by captain, so I couldn't take
Oh,
captain.
dang. Okay, see, it's a real
I've
thing.
never heard of captain.
It's sort of a joke. Just saying there's not, like, if there's ma'am and sir, there's not a great third, but apparently captain works for your colleague. That's great.
Captain
Yeah.
Engineer, that's all I can think of.
Yeah.
That's all.
I kind of like boss.
I was going to say boss. Your Majesty.
Your Majesty is gender neutral too.
I was like, Reverend works for me. That's fine. Yeah, Dacia.
I like the teacher boss idea, but like I wish we could adopt things from Japanese because san is gender neutral, I think sama is
Okay, yeah.
honorific, so.
Yeah, a lot of other languages have these gender neutral things, and we're just, fumbling around in the English
It's
language.
like the Indians have a two-spirited person. I like that one. Two-spirited.
Dutch and Spanish both have formal use.
Yes, yeah. And English used to have the formal and informal you. Thou. Thou was the informal, though, which is so weird because it sounds formal to us, but that was the informal, and you was the formal, right? Something like that, yeah. Thou. Which is why it's interesting when some of our hymns refer to God with thou, it's like more intimate in relation. Okay, we won't go down that rabbit hole, but yeah. Anything else by the way, we are I'm making pronoun stickers that y'all can put on your name tags if you want. I should have printed them today and I didn't. But we'll have those with name tags if you would like to put your pronouns on your name tag.
Your Majesty.
Okay, intersectionality. This is a word that I know has come up in our anti-racist work, and this is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It's the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. And so this is relevant. So as we think about LGBTQIA plus inclusion, we think about how that intersects with these other identities and areas of marginalization, and acknowledging that, you know, a queer Black woman experiences racism differently than a straight Black man, also experiences queerness differently than a queer white man. You know, there are these ways that it's not an oppression Olympics thing. It's a qualitative difference in how people experience marginalization and oppression, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. Oh, pride flag quiz time. Okay.
Yeah, who knows, I'm just gonna ask.
Here's a pride flag. Oh, I didn't refresh my memory. There was a whole thing of like what all the colors. Does anybody know what all the colors stood for originally? They were a little different at first.
Is red always on top though? Either?
Give me a second. I got more flags coming. Don't worry. There's a bunch more slides. So yeah, the original pride flag had not these exact colors, but they had specific symbolism, and then it's been developed into this is sort of the rainbow pride flag. This is the one we have in our sanctuary. This is called the Philly pride flag. It adds the black and brown bars to signify, again, intersectionality, thinking about how being Black or brown and queer of some flavor influences that. What flag is this? Trans pride. We also have this in our sanctuary. Wonderful. Y'all know what this one is called? Progress pride. Yes. So it combines the Philly flag and the trans pride flag. And the arrow is progress. Yeah. We like the symbolism. Oh, here's another version of the progress pride flag. So this circle stands for intersex people. So if you see that purple circle on the yellow background, and sometimes it's a standalone flag of its own, but that stands for intersex. Intersex people are people who are born where the doctor can't tell right away which sex they are, and often there's, yeah.
Hope and
Hey, don't.
conflict.
I haven't seen it yet.
Spoiler alert.
Spoilers.
Quick question about colors.
Yes.
In the same cultural appropriation vein, as I asked my previous question, I've loved rainbows since I was 6, and I use them all the time. Does that, I wondered if that was like, am I representing myself incorrectly, or like, is it okay that I still use rainbows?
Rainbows have meaning beyond being gay.
Yeah.
I mean, Noah and the art. You know. Yeah. No. Yeah. No. That's a fair question. Yeah. No, that's fine. And people might more readily identify you as an ally or whatever. And that's, yeah. So that's great. Yeah. We love rainbows. Everybody can use rainbows. Ooh, who knows what this one is?
Pretty.
Lesbian pride. How about this one? Gay men. You don't need to know this. It's just kind of fun to go through. There's like a zillion pride flags. This one? Bisexual pride.
Non-binary.
Non-binary.
Asexual.
Asexual, yeah.
Aromantic asexual.
Yeah, aromantic, asexual. Yeah, so this is the asexual pride flag.
Trisexual?
Well, this is the pansexual pride flag. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, enough. All right. So I feel like since it's a church, we should talk about the Bible some. A lot of times in these contexts, when we talk about the Bible, we start with the verses that are used to exclude queer people. We're not going to do that here anymore. The Bible is queer. And this is an anachronistic term that I am applying to an ancient text, and I know that, and I don't care. But there are some places that I think it is really helpful to lift up where in scripture there are binaries being transgressed that often get erased, sometimes very intentionally. One of my favorite examples is in Genesis 37. We know Joseph in the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Some people have taken to calling it Joseph in the pretty, pretty princess dress, because when you hear about his robe that his father gave him, the term used there in Hebrew is ketonet pasim, and we don't actually know what this word means. So people have interpreted it to mean a colorful robe, a robe with long sleeves, all these things. But as I first learned from a drag queen who was preaching at Wake Divinity School, the only other time that the term ketonet pasim is used is in 1 Samuel, and it refers specifically to a garb that is worn by the daughter of the king. So if we use context clues, it's a pretty princess dress. So Joseph, queering fashion since whatever year we might want to say that.
What did you say, the daughter?
The daughter of the king, so a princess. It's and it's presented as like a custom, like a traditional garb for a princess to wear. And so that's the only other context that we have for understanding this term that shows up in Genesis 37. In Isaiah 58, there's a passage specifically about eunuchs, and there are prescriptions in the Bible around. Listen, the one time I ever tried to open my Bible to seek random inspiration by putting my finger on a passage, I opened it to Deuteronomy 23, verse 1, which is, no one whose penis is crushed or testicles are cut off can enter the kingdom. I never did that prayer practice again after that. But it's interesting because there are these prohibitions around sexual and gender identity that then are sort of defied in Isaiah 58. And this is all, in the context of the Hebrew Bible. But there's a lot of it has to do with passing on your name, that if you can't father children, you can't pass on your name. And in Isaiah 58, there's this declaration that the eunuchs' names will last, that they have, I don't know, inheritance or something. And then Acts 8 is another one where we see a eunuch, Ethiopian eunuch. So this is a sexual gender minority who is in conversation with Philip, who is baptized and comes to faith. And then there also are sort of queer readings of David and Jonathan. I think there's a passage that says like David loved Jonathan like more than he loved any woman. Ruth and Naomi, whether, there are like lesbian readings of that, but then also just like found family as a value of queer communities. There are a lot of passages on inclusion, celebration of diversity, all of this. So I think it's really important to emphasize that LGBTQIA plus inclusion is not just about pushing back against negative examples in scripture. It's about uplifting and bringing to the front these positive examples that we do actually have. Any questions about these? Yeah.
Sarah, the term when you just opened the Bible and said that you were inspired is called Bible thumping.
Yeah.
It is. And I got that from a queer hemophiliac that was raised in Cairo, Georgia, but lives in New York as an author.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. If that method works for you, I'm thrilled for you. I will not be doing it anymore.
Divinely inspired.
Sarah, how do you deal with the portions of the Bible that are blatantly anti-gay?
We're getting there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Leviticus, right?
We're getting there. Okay, what about the clobber verses? So this is sometimes what we call the passages that are most often used to exclude queer people, the clobber verses, which is beating somebody up. Okay, one important thing. What have I told y'all about the phrase, the Bible clearly says? Be wary. And notice that this usually shows up when we're talking about queer people. It never shows up when we're talking about welcoming the stranger or feeding the hungry. You don't hear people say that. So that's just something to generally keep in mind. So these are some of the verses that get used. And this is going to be like a really brief blow by blow. I did a presentation a couple years ago that is on YouTube where we got into this in more detail. So I can share that if you're interested. Genesis 19 is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You all have probably heard that this is a straight up condemnation of being gay. It's not. It's about inhospitality. It even says later in the Bible, in I think Ezekiel, there's a reference back to Sodom and Gomorrah that explicitly says their sin was that they did not welcome people. This is a story about rape. It's not about being gay. Leviticus 18 and 20 refer to lying with a man as with a woman as an abomination. Here in this context, these are all purity laws that are about the covenant and the culture of Judaism at the time. And there was a high concern for preserving gender roles. There's a context around incest. And just note that like lesbians don't get condemned anywhere in the Bible, which is hilarious. So again, not really about what we're talking about today when we refer to LGBTQIA plus people. Romans 1, this is one of my favorites. This is where we read about it. It gets read as saying that that same-sex desire is against nature. The term that gets used there in Greek is paraphusin. Gene Rogers is a professor at UNCG who's wonderful, and he did a deep dive into this phrase and realized that it gets used in other contexts to mean alongside nature or beyond nature in a way that sometimes the Holy Spirit is described as working. And that's different from being contrary to nature. And he lifts that up as actually a celebration of queerness, as expanding what we think of as natural. And his work is finally starting to feel dated, which is great news. 1 Corinthians 6, there's a term there that gets translated as homosexual. That word was not in the Bible until 1940 something, I can't remember. Yeah, thank you, yes. And the Greek term there is malakoi. We don't actually really know what that means. So again, the Bible clearly says, doesn't. And 1 Timothy 1, this is another passage that's about coercion and not orientation. And a lot of these condemnations of practices that we read as being about same-sex attraction are actually about sort of temple cults and pederasty and stuff that would be good to condemn. So that's my very brief summary. I can send you more resources if you want to get deeper into that.
You can choose and pick anything in the Bible to validate your point. So
True. And yeah, reading it all in context, reading the arc, the threads is important. All right, pop quiz. What did Jesus say about being LGBTQ+? Y'all are so smart. You didn't say it. So there's that. Okay, a brief overview of LGBTQ+ inclusion in the UMC. So in 1972 is when exclusionary language was first introduced into our book of discipline. The saddest part of this story was that it started with someone who was actually kind of trying to be affirming. I have a whole conspiracy theory about how this is the year that the American Psychological Association was debating removing homosexuality from the DSM as a mental disorder. So this was sort of like in the air as a conversation. And someone brought to the general conference, the one body that can make rules and law for the UMC, something that wanted to say that homosexuals are people of sacred worth. That's all he wanted to say. Committees got a hold of it. Things got expanded on and twisted around. And we ended up with one of our, what we call incompatibility clauses that said that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. I've told y'all this before. What's the one other thing that our discipline has said is incompatible with Christian teaching? War. Yes, war. That's the only other time we use that phrase. That's a problem to me. Anyway, so General Conference is the global gathering of United Methodists. That it's the only body that has the power to change anything in the Book of Discipline. So every 4 years since 1972, this language was challenged, but then it was often strengthened. And provisions were added to prohibit both same-sex marriage and out queer clergy. I should say, actually, lesbian and gay are the terms that were used. So some people have delighted in not actually falling into either of those categories, but definitely not fitting what the discipline intended. In 2016, so leading up to 2016, there was a lot more concerted effort to make changes to our policies to allow queer clergy to serve openly and to allow same-sex weddings to happen in Methodist churches. There was a one church plan that was put forward that would keep the church together, keep the denomination together, but allow for discernment in different areas and different congregations around how to handle this. That plan failed, and at that point, there was just a lot of frustration. We're the last major denomination to deal with this, the last mainline denomination. And so there was a special general conference in 2019. We had a whole extra global gathering of people. And at that, there was an effort to remove harmful language from the discipline, but instead the traditionalists won. And the language, the exclusionary language, was actually strengthened, and there were new consequences added for clergy who defied those prohibitions. So that was very discouraging. We were supposed to have General Conference in 2020, and this was seen as going to be sort of a reckoning. But we all know what happened in 2020, a global pandemic. We postponed General Conference several times. And what had happened at the 2019 General Conference was that, so one thing that has made this conversation complicated for United Methodists is that we don't really own our buildings. Our buildings are held in trust by the denomination. So like Green Street, we can't just be like, we want to move somewhere else, we're going to sell our building and move. That's not a thing. And so it's hard for churches to leave the denomination. At the 2019 General Conference, a provision was added to allow churches to exit the denomination with their property for a cost. And the intention was that the more progressive churches would leave and let the traditionalists have the denomination. And there are a couple of progressive churches that did, but by and large, that is not what happened. And as General Conference 2020 got postponed, some of what was going on was that bishops were not enforcing the more stringent language and consequences. And so basically, they were allowing clergy to operate, as if the language had been changed. And this did not sit well with the traditionalists. So eventually, more conservative churches started using that provision from the 2019 General Conference to leave the denomination. And in 2022, the Global Methodist Church launched. So this is a newer expression of Methodism. Not every church that has left the UMC has gone global, but many have. And so sometimes if you're driving around and you see the United scratched out on somebody's church sign, they might be Global Methodist, or they may have just gone independent or with some other denomination. But there was a time limit on those disaffiliations. So the end of 2023 in our conference, that was the end of disaffiliation. So we lost a lot of churches in that process. Our district, the Yadkin Valley district, actually lost the most. And I credit that to our DS Sam Moore, who came and spoke to our leadership in that season, was unapologetically saying, we are moving forward toward LGBTQ inclusion as a denomination. We want you along with us for this journey, but if you cannot take that journey, then we wish you well on your way. In 2024, we finally had technically the 2020 General Conference, and all of the harmful language was removed by wildly high votes. It was insane. And there were a lot of places, because it wasn't just these prohibitions around ordination and marriage. There were also limitations around funding with certain agencies. So actually, my friend Molly kind of combed through the entire discipline, found all the stuff, and was able to get it all removed. The most contention was around the definition of marriage, and this actually got really interesting because they were trying to change it from a man and a woman to two persons, to adults of, I don't remember how exactly it was phrased. But part of the challenge of our denomination is that we are worldwide, and we have churches in Africa where having a definition like that would actually be harmful to them. They live in countries where same-sex marriage is illegal and punishable by death. And unexpectedly, this African delegate came to the mic and proposed a double-barrel definition of marriage, which at first I thought was really dumb, but I came to see the wisdom of it, that we define marriage in two ways now in the UMC, between two adults of consenting age or between a man and a woman. And that or makes space for churches that are in social and political contexts where it is unsafe to have such a broad definition of marriage, but it also makes space for particularly the American church to do that. So
Africa has the largest population of Methodists too, right?
I'll have to double check that because a lot has changed in the last couple of years. Yeah, a lot has changed the last couple of years. But yeah, it's a lot. Nate.
The churches that disaffiliated, every single one of them had to pay some type of leaving fee or something.
Yeah.
Or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, there were stipulations around building, and also if their pastor wasn't leaving, they had to pay out their pension obligation and maybe some salary stuff depending on the context. So yeah.
Right, how much? Well, was that substantial amount of money for each congregation?
Yes. Yeah, it was not cheap. So there definitely are UMCs who wish they could have left but could not for financial reasons. Yeah. So that's
$100,000 type of thing.
I don't know,
All right.
but yeah, for a lot of small churches, even less than that would be prohibitive too.
Yeah. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
David.
curious, we went to a wedding yesterday. It was at a church that used to be called, where's my wife?
She's over here.
I just blanked on the name.
I think it was Calvary Baptist.
It used to be called Calvary Baptist Church, and it's now Calvary Church. And the wedding ceremony was clearly not meant to be inclusive of anything.
Okay.
Just a man and a woman. And I'm curious, what have other denominations done? Have they faced these same issues?
Yes, so I mentioned we're the last mainline denomination to deal with this, and by mainline, that kind of means like Episcopalian, Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, whatever. So the Episcopal Church it was a whole terrible thing in the early 2000s. So it's not been pretty in other denominations, but we usually don't necessarily think of Baptists as mainline just because their denominational structure is so much more dispersed. But we're the last of the denominations. So, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, is technically open and affirming, Episcopal Church, all these things. Now, of course, it varies congregation to congregation. I had somebody once ask me before General Conference last year if the language was removed, would all Methodist churches suddenly be like Green Street? And I said, no, not at all. And there are churches that have still chosen to not allow same-sex weddings in their congregations, or who have said that they don't want a queer clergy person. Joke's on them. Some of them have already had those. They just didn't know, and they left them. But anyway, so it's an ongoing process. And so I'm on the LGBTQ inclusion team for our conference. And a lot of what we're doing right now is working on some educational resources for churches who maybe aren't there in terms of being affirming, but want to learn more. We know there's some that may not get there anytime soon, or maybe even ever. But for those that are interested, we're really trying to work and equip them to start to move on that journey. So, yeah. Yes.
Curious about Reconciling Ministries Network. It's a resource that's out there. And is that interdenominational, or is that a UMC thing?
It's a UMC thing. So it's its own organization, but it's United Methodist in connection. So we talk about this like a caucusing group for United Methodists. And so they're in the midst of kind of looking at what is their role right in this season, because so much of their focus before was on changing the language. And so these resources that I'm talking about are coming through Reconciling Ministries, and they're doing a lot of other work to support queer clergy and help congregations learn and grow. So yeah, so they're still around. Okay, Green Street and LGBTQ inclusion. So Green Street became a reconciling congregation, the first reconciling congregation in Western North Carolina in 2009. And I'm told we have Nina Mabe to thank for that. If anybody knew Nina back in the day, she really pushed Kelly to move the church in that direction. In 2013, Green Street introduced their public marriage statement. So this was before marriage equality, in a moment where North Carolina was trying to introduce Amendment 1, which would have really doubled down on language of marriage being between a man and a woman. This was probably anticipating like a national marriage equality. And so in resistance to that, the leadership here asked the pastor to not do any weddings in the building until everyone could be married under both civil law and church law. By the time I came, it had been a really long time since that marriage statement had been put in place. And I asked around, and what I guessed was true. Nobody expected that we would still be having this policy in place 8 years later, whatever. And so we put together a marriage policy work group and adopted an inclusive wedding policy in 2022 before that was made okay by the General Conference. So
when we did that, we got our Midwestern protesters.
in 2013, y'all had some
y'all
had some protesters, and we had some great support from Renewal Fellowship and some other congregations locally. Yeah. Yeah.
So what do the adoptive inclusion wedding policy say?
So we went with our wedding policy is actually very simple, and it kind of just says the pastor can decide who gets married here. But we included in the document like a description of and reference to the previous policy to name these values at Green Street. But we had actually observed there are other churches not as progressive as Green Street that realized their wedding policies were actually vague enough that they could do same-sex weddings without having to change anything, which was kind of cool. And just acknowledging that you can start like listing every single contingency of like, oh yeah, these people can get married and these people, and just to say, let's keep this open, have that context. They're not going to send anybody to this church who's like going to refuse to do a wedding based on somebody's. That would be mutiny. That is a whole other conversation that I'm not going to get into today, but it's starting to come up in some places. Yeah, I'm not, yeah. That's starting to come up. Okay, that's Green Street. I just wanted to share this quote. This is from a book called Queer Virtue by Elizabeth Edman. She's a lesbian Episcopal priest, and she writes about the ways that her queerness helps make her a better Christian and how she thinks queer people can make the church better. She says, her queer identity has taught me more about how to be a good Christian than has the church. I think that's cool. I mentioned the RMN glossary. We've got some copies there and the QR code. Here are a couple of books. So I mentioned Queer Virtue. Transforming is a great book by Austen Hartke, specifically about transgender Christians. From Sin to Amazing Grace by Patrick Cheng is another good one. Liz?
Brandon Robinson is putting out a book for queer Christian. He's a theologian. I think he's a pastor as well in New York.
Okay, awesome. Say his name again.
Brandon Robinson.
Brandon Robinson, Queer Christian. Yeah, look out for that. And then another one, there's a book called UnClobber that really digs into the clobber verses. I don't always put that at the forefront because it's very much about a straight person's journey from not being affirming to being affirming, which is an important story, but like, I don't think queer people need to read that book, but that's just my opinion. But it can be really helpful if that's like part of your journey and process. So UnClobber.
There's a book, and this isn't about spirit, but by Hamniak, it says what the Bible actually says about homosexuality.
Uh-huh.
And I've got it. If anyone
Okay.
wants to read.
Great.
It's a good book.
Thanks, Ree. I'm going to invite us to maybe just have a little bit of conversation, and then also just we have an activity. Write your representatives. I've got stamped envelopes and sheets of paper over here, as well as this QR code is over at the table as well, so that you can find your representative's address. We know there's a lot of legislation that is coming down that harms LGBTQ plus people, and we want to make sure that our representatives know that their constituents are not okay with that. So if you would like to do that. Kim.
Just for resources, 1946 is an interesting documentary about the RSV translation of the Bible and how the word homosexual got into it at all. I know it's available on Amazon. If you don't want to go there, you might still look up 1946 and see if it's available any other way, but it is an interesting documentary.
Yeah.
Sarah, you mentioned another documentary earlier.
Everybody? Yeah, that's, I should have put this. It's about intersex folks. It's really good. So here's this one.
I've been advocating for forever, like 2005, in Congress and the State House. So if anyone needs resources about who our elected people are, how we can get in touch with them, addresses and all that, I can do it for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Yeah.
There's also, if you're interested, like, around questions around intersex, NPR recently did a really good podcast on their shortwave podcast about sex, like sex, like male-female, and it was super accessible even if you're not a science person, and they interviewed a lot of people who do, like, are experts in their field, so it was really cool to hear, like, what is, like, the top of the science on that right now.
Yeah,
What's the
awesome.
name of it?
NPR shortwave.
Shortwave is the podcast, and they did one about,
Just look up shortwave.
so we got shortwave, that's the name of the podcast, and then, like, the episode, I don't remember what it was called, but
Found it.
I thought it was helpful.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Conversation. I'm going to stop recording and